Ely, Minnesota, October 1949. The air already carried the fairest bite of the coming winter, a metallic tang that promised deep cold and killing winds. On a scoured patch of cut-over land northwest of town, a place littered with granite bones left by the glaciers, Ivan Marković was doing something no one had ever seen before. He wasn't building a cabin. He was wrestling a piece of the Second World War into a crack in the earth. The surplus Quonset hut, 20 feet of corrugated steel arching like a silver caterpillar, lay at the mouth of a narrow granite fissure. The rock walls rose 40 feet on either side, sheer and gray, separated by a gap of no more than 24 feet. With a block and tackle anchored to a stubborn jack pine and a hand-cranked winch bolted to a granite outcrop, Ivan was slowly, painstakingly, inching the metal shell into the stone embrace of the crevice. The sound of the winch's clicking pawl was a lonely metronome in the vast, quiet landscape. It drew spectators. Ronald Kalinsky, the Ely mine safety inspector, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of professional disapproval. He'd driven his Ford out on the logging track, clipboard on the passenger seat, to see the madness for himself. "You're putting it right against the rock face, Marković," Kalinsky called out, his voice sharp with authority. He pointed a gloved finger. "There's no standoff, no drainage plane. You'll have condensation turning to a solid sheet of ice on your interior walls by Thanksgiving." He shook his head, a gesture of pity mixed with official exasperation. "It's a fool's gambit. You're building a freezer, not a home." Silas Croft, who'd lost a thumb to a saw blade at the Winton mill and knew timber better than his own children, spat a stream of tobacco juice near a stump. "Damnedest thing I ever saw. That metal will pull the heat right out of your bones. Be like living inside a cold chisel. He's a madman." Gunnar Olson, a farmer whose family had fought this land for 2 generations, just stared. "It's unnatural," he muttered to Croft. "A house belongs on the land, not in it. What happens when the frost heaves? That rock will crush it like a tin can." Ivan Marković paused his work at the winch. He wiped a smear of grease from his hand with a rag, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He looked at the men, his eyes calm. He was a compact, powerful man with the thick wrists and forearms of someone who had spent a lifetime working with heavy, unyielding materials. He said nothing of condensation, or heat loss, or frost heaves. He simply said, "The rock will keep us warm." A short, dry laugh escaped Kalinsky. He made a note on his clipboard. "We'll see about that," he said, turning back toward his car. The others shuffled away, shaking their heads, their diagnosis confirmed. The newcomer, the Croatian, was not just foolish. He was crazy. The mockery would last through the autumn. The validation would have to wait for the polar vortex. What did this Dalmatian Cleaser, this quarryman turned marine engineer, understand about the immense, slow-breathing thermal battery of the Precambrian shield that the iron miners and lumbermen of Ely, for all their hard-won experience, had completely missed? This channel is dedicated to the stories of quiet ingenuity, of forgotten wisdom that solved impossible problems on the frontier. The answers are often found not in fighting nature, but in understanding it. If you believe practical knowledge is the most powerful tool a person can possess, consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell so you don't miss a single story. I promise you will learn something about the physics of survival that you won't find in any textbook. Tell us in the comments. What's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Ivan Marković was not a carpenter. He was not a logger. He was not a frontiersman in the way the men of Ely understood the term. He was a klesser, a stoneworker from the Dalmatian coast near Split, a region where the world was made of limestone karst. His hands didn't know the feel of an axe handle or a saw grip. They knew the dense, chalky weight of a freshly quarried block, the sharp ring of a mallet on a steel chisel, the patient scrape of a finishing tool smoothing a lintel. He had grown up in a world where you didn't build on the stone, you built with it. You built into it. Houses were anchored to it. Cellars were carved from it. And life was lived in a constant, intimate dialogue with the bedrock. He understood, in his bones, that stone was not dead. It was just very, very slow. It held the memory of summer's heat deep into the autumn, and the ghost of winter's chill far into the spring. His time in the U.S. Marine Corps during the war had added a new material to his vocabulary: corrugated steel. As an engineer, he'd learned to assemble Quonset huts on Pacific islands, marveling at their structural efficiency and speed of construction. They were strong, simple, and cheap. But he also saw their fatal flaw: they had no thermal mass. They were a thin skin against the world, heating up like an oven in the tropical sun and shedding warmth instantly when the temperature dropped. In his mind, the two materials, the ancient massive stone of his homeland and the modern lightweight steel of the American military, began a conversation. When he brought his wife, Yelena, and their two young children, Luca and Anna, to the Iron Range after the war, drawn by the promise of work and the presence of a small but tight-knit Croatian community, that conversation became a matter of survival. They spent their first winter, the winter of 1948, in a hastily built board and batten shack on the edge of town. It was a flimsy box that stood in defiant opposition to the Minnesota winter, and it was a battle the shack lost every single night. That winter was a litany of small, miserable failures. Ivan would wake in the pre-dawn dark to find a rime of ice, thick as a thumbnail, coating the nail heads on the interior walls, each nail a tiny, perfect conductor pulling the killing cold straight through the wood. Yelena's prized compact mirror, a gift from her mother she'd carried all the way from Croatia, cracked clean in half one morning on her bedside table, the glass contracting so violently in the cold that it shattered. Young Luca, trying to do his schoolwork, found the town hall inkwell they'd been given had frozen into a solid black plug of ice. They lived in a constant, shivering twilight, huddled around a stove that devoured wood, but produced only a small circle of habitable warmth. A neighbor, trying to get his Willys Jeep started on a particularly brutal morning, found the extreme cold had frozen the differential seal solid, cracking it and spilling the gear oil onto the snow. That winter taught Ivan a fundamental truth. The conventional frontier cabin wasn't a shelter. It was a siege, and the siege was slowly winning. The problem wasn't just the cold. The problem was the wind. The Iron Range was a landscape of funnels, and the north wind in January was a relentless, physical force that stripped heat from any surface it touched. The standard cabins of Ely were built to fight the cold, but they fundamentally misunderstood the enemy. They were built with wood, a material with a respectable R value, but they were full of seams. Every joint between logs, every window frame, every door jamb was an invitation for infiltration. Convection was the true killer. The wind would force cold air through 1,000 tiny gaps, while the rising heat from the stove would pull it in from below, creating a constant, invisible river of frigid air flowing across the floor. Families would stuff rags, moss, and newspaper into the cracks, a futile annual ritual. They burned prodigious amounts of wood. A standard 16 by 20 foot cabin might consume 10 to 12 cords of hardwood to survive a winter, representing hundreds of hours of back-breaking labor with an axe and a cross-cut saw. And for all that fuel, they were still cold. The air temperature 6 feet off the floor might be a tolerable 60 degrees, but at ankle level, It was often barely above freezing. Children slept in their coats. Water buckets left too far from the stove would skin over with ice overnight. It was a life spent in a perpetual state of thermal defense, a war of attrition against the laws of physics. The real failure, Ivan realized, was one of imagination. The settlers saw the forest and thought only of timber. They saw the granite outcrops and thought only of obstacles. They built their thin wooden shells to stand up against the wind, exposing all four walls to its relentless assault. They were fighting a battle on four fronts. Ivan decided he would fight on only two. He spent the spring of 1949 walking the cut-over lands, not with the eye of a logger looking for trees, but with the eye of a cleaser looking for the right stone. He carried a compass, a measuring tape, and a geologist's hammer. He wasn't looking for a building site. He was looking for a partner. He found it in late May, a deep, narrow fissure in a granite ridge, oriented almost perfectly on an east-west axis. The walls were sheer, stable, and 40 feet high. The gap was 24 feet at the base. He measured the sun's path, noting that the high southern wall would be in shadow most of the winter day, preventing unwanted melt and refreeze cycles at the base. He found a natural vertical split in the north wall that rose all the way to the top, a perfect, pre-made chimney flue. He bought the worthless, rocky plot for a pittance. Then he took a train to Duluth and bought a surplus Quonset hut, still in its crate, for $150. The build began in August. The first step was preparing the site. With star drills and a sledgehammer, he painstakingly chipped away at the base of the rock walls, creating two perfectly flat, parallel vertical surfaces that were exactly 20 feet apart. It was brutal, slow work, the kind of labor that made sense only to a man who had shaped stone his entire life. The sound of his hammer ringing against the drill steel echoed from the rock walls, a lonely, rhythmic proclamation of his intent. Then came the assembly. On the flat ground in front of the crevice, he and Yelena, with help from a few curious members of the Croatian Fraternal Union Lodge, bolted the steel ribs together and attached the corrugated sheets. When it was fully assembled, a perfect silver arch, the real challenge began. Using the winch, rollers, and sheer stubbornness, he began to slide the 2,500-pound structure into the fissure. This was the height of the public mockery. Kalinsky made his official visit. "Marković, I'm telling you, this is a violation of the 1946 Mine District Setback Ordinance, Section 4, Paragraph B. No permanent habitation structure shall be erected within 50 feet of a rock face exceeding 20 feet in height. This is a quarrying district. The rule is for blast safety and rockfall." "There is no blasting here," Ivan said, not looking up from the winch handle. "It doesn't matter," Kalinsky insisted, his voice rising with the frustration of a man whose authority was being quietly ignored. "A rule is a rule. This structure is illegal. I'm putting a note in the county file. You'll have an eviction order by spring thaw, I guarantee it." He gestured at the tight fit. "And it's a technical nightmare. You're creating a direct conductive pathway. That steel touching that granite? The rock is 50 degrees now, maybe. In January, the surface will be 20 below zero. It will suck every BTU you produce right into the Canadian shield. You might as well try to heat the whole state of Minnesota with that little stove of yours." Ivan paused, looked at the inspector, then at the massive gray walls of his new partner. "The surface will be cold," he said quietly. "The deep rock will not." Kalinsky just shook his head and walked away. Yelena watched him go, a worried line on her forehead. She came over and placed a hand on Ivan's arm. "He can make us leave, Ivan?" He stopped cranking the winch and looked at her. He pointed to the thick steel arch pressed hard against the smooth granite wall. "This is a good wall, Yelena," he said, his voice soft. He patted the rock. And this is a better wall. 2 good walls are better than 1. It was the most he had said about his theory to anyone. She looked at the strange metal house disappearing into the rock, then back at her husband's calm, confident face. She nodded and went back to helping him guide the rollers. The physics of Ivan's design were both profoundly simple and completely alien to the local building culture. His neighbors built cabins that were thermally isolated from the ground, perched on piers or stone foundations. They saw the earth as a source of cold and damp, something to be kept at a distance. Ivan saw the earth as a massive, stable reservoir of energy. The key was rock mass coupling. Granite has a density of approximately 170 pounds per cubic foot. The Quonset hut, 20 feet long and nestled in the crevice, was in direct contact with a wall of granite on each side. A quick calculation revealed the staggering scale of the thermal battery he had tapped into. For every foot of its length, the hut was buffered by a volume of rock on both sides that weighed over 500 tons. The total mass of the granite in direct thermal communication with his home was in the tens of thousands of tons. This colossal mass acted like a flywheel for temperature. While the air temperature in Ely could swing from 80 degrees in the summer to 40 below in the winter, a 120-degree range, the temperature of the Earth 10 feet below the surface remains remarkably constant, hovering around the local average annual air temperature, which in that part of Minnesota is about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. By pressing the conductive steel skin of the Quonset directly against the rock, Ivan wasn't trying to insulate his home from the granite. He was doing the opposite. He was coupling his home to it, allowing the steady, unwavering 45-degree temperature of the deep rock to constantly pull the temperature of his walls toward that equilibrium. Kalinsky was right that the surface of the rock would get cold, but he was wrong about its influence. The immense thermal mass of the deep rock would overwhelm the superficial chill of the surface, conducting its stored warmth steadily outward. The steel walls of the hut wouldn't be at the temperature of the air. They would be at the temperature of the mountain. The second principle was wind sheltering. A cabin out in the open was exposed to the full force of the wind, which dramatically accelerates heat loss. An object at 20-degree shears in a 25 man-earth wind loses heat at the same rate as an object at 52-degree in calm air. This wind chill factor was what made the Minnesota winter so lethal. Ivan's crevice was a perfect windbreak. The 40-foot-high rock walls created a massive wind wake, a zone of relative calm. The wind might be howling at 25 miles per hour over the top of the ridge, but down in the fissure, the air was almost still. This single design choice effectively raised the ambient temperature his home experienced by more than 20 degrees. He hadn't just built a home, he had built a microclimate. He finished the front and back walls with insulated timber framing, installing a sturdy door and 2 small double-paned windows. He ran the stovepipe from his small cast-iron stove directly into the natural chimney fissure he'd identified in the rock wall. By the first snowfall in November, the Marković family had moved in. The inside was strange and cave-like, the curved metal walls pressing in. But it was their own. That winter, a polar vortex descended on the Vermilion Range. It was a cold of historical proportions. For 11 consecutive nights, the official temperature at the Ely Town Hall did not rise above minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A brutal, scouring north wind of 25 miles per hour funneled down the range, driving the wind chill to a level where exposed flesh would freeze in under a minute. It was a winter that would be spoken of for decades, a winter that broke machines and men. For the families in the conventional cabins, it was a time of pure misery. Silas Croft's family moved their beds into a single room, stuffing every crack with rags and hanging blankets over the door. They kept their stove glowing cherry red around the clock, yet they still woke to frozen water buckets and the sight of their own breath fogging in the air. The Olsons' newborn baby developed a croupy, persistent cough. They burned through a month's worth of wood in 10 days. The cold was an invading army that could not be repelled. In the crevice, life was different. The contrast was stark and absolute. Outside the Marković front door, the wind howled, a physical pressure against the wood. The temperature was a staggering 40 degrees below zero. Inside, the single, small stove whispered with a low fire, consuming a fraction of the wood their neighbors burned. The interior temperature held steady at 68 degrees. The true difference wasn't in the thermometer. It was in the quality of the stillness. There were no drafts, none. A candle flame on the dinner table stood perfectly erect, unshaken by the Arctic gale raging just a few feet away. The curved steel walls, which Kalinsky had predicted would be coated in ice, were cool to the touch but completely dry, holding a steady temperature of just over 45 degrees. The immense granite mass on the other side was performing its silent, powerful work, anchoring the home's thermal environment. The domestic warmth was proven in the smallest details. Yelena found that the stone-dusted countertop near the back wall was the perfect temperature for proofing bread dough. The gentle, steady warmth radiated from the rock, and her loaves rose high and light, a simple act of baking that would have been impossible in any other house in Ely. The most telling piece of evidence sat on a simple wooden shelf on the inside of the Quonset's curved wall. It was a glass jar of Dalmatian brûlée, a rich fish stew Jelena had made. Its dark, clear broth was full of onions and chunks of pike. All through the polar vortex, while every neighbor's pantry supplies froze solid, stews turning to brown pucks of ice, potatoes freezing hard as rocks, the jar of brûlée remained perfectly liquid, its broth clear and unfrozen, a silent, edible testament to the genius of the design. In mid-January, on the 9th day of the deep freeze, Ronald Kalinsky decided it was time to survey the Marković property to prepare the official eviction notice he planned to serve in the spring. It was a brutal day for the task. His Ford wouldn't start, so he had to snowshoe the 2 miles from the main road. The air was so cold it felt like breathing microscopic shards of glass. The metal on his snowshoes creaked in protest with every step. He carried a small acetylene hand warmer, a miner's trick for keeping fingers functional in the cold. But the cold was too deep. Half a mile from the crevice, the valve on the hand warmer froze shut. He fumbled with it, his thick gloves making the task impossible. He pulled one off, and the instant pain of the cold on his bare skin was shocking. He gave up, his fingers already stiff and useless. He was angry. At the cold, at his frozen truck, and most of all at the stubborn Croatian who was forcing him to be out in it. As he approached the fissure, he could see the plume of smoke rising from the stovepipe, remarkably thin and lazy for such a cold day. He trudged into the mouth of the crevice, and the first thing he noticed was the silence. The wind, which had been a constant deafening roar in his ears, was simply gone. The air was dead calm. He took another 10 steps into the shelter of the rock walls and stopped. Something was wrong. The air wasn't just calm, it was warmer, measurably warmer. He leaned against the sheer granite wall, expecting to feel the biting, hostile cold of the rock. He braced for it, but what his body registered was utterly baffling. The rock wasn't cold, it felt neutral, almost warm. He pulled off his remaining glove and pressed his bare palm flat against the granite. He expected the searing pain of contact with a super-chilled surface. Instead, he felt a steady, undeniable coolness that was somehow leaching the dangerous frost out of his aching fingers. It wasn't warmth, but it was the absence of killing cold. It felt like life. He stood there for a full minute, pressing his palm against the ancient stone, a look of profound disbelief on his face. Without thinking, he reached up with his other hand and undid the frozen leather straps on his ear flaps, letting them fall. It was an unconscious act of a man moving from a hostile environment to a safe one. He walked the final 20 yards to the front door of the Quonset. Through the small window, he could see the family inside. The two children, Luca and Anna, were sitting on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. They were in their shirt sleeves. On the shelf behind them, Kalinsky saw the jar of fish stew, its broth shimmering in the lantern light. Liquid. Ivan Marković saw him through the window and opened the door. A wave of simple, comfortable warmth washed over Kalinsky, carrying the smell of baking bread and wood smoke. There was no blast of frigid air rushing in from the floor, no sense of a house fighting for its life. It was just normal. "Mr. Kalinsky," Ivan said, his voice even, "you are cold. Come in." Kalinsky stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. He looked around the curved, cave-like room, at the warm, dry walls, at the children playing on the floor. He looked at the small stove, barely idling. He was a man whose entire professional life was based on understanding risk, safety, and the unforgiving physics of the North. Everything he knew said this place should be an ice tomb. But the evidence of his senses was undeniable. He finally looked at Ivan, not as an inspector looking at a violator, but as a student looking at a teacher. "How?" Kalinsky asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ivan gestured to the wall. "The house has two walls, a thin one of steel and a thick one of stone. The stone is the one that matters." Kalinsky slowly shook his head, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He walked over and placed his hand on the metal wall, feeling the same impossible, life-giving neutrality he'd felt from the granite outside. "My God, Marković," he said, the words coming slowly as the concept fully formed in his mind. "You didn't build a shelter against the mountain. You built a lung inside of it." The eviction notice was never filed. The story of how the Marković family had spent the great cold snap in shirt-sleeve comfort, burning less wood than anyone in the county, spread quickly. But it was Ronald Kalinsky who became the most powerful advocate. He spoke of it at the mine office, at the town hall, at the VFW post. He described the warmth of the rock, the stillness of the air, the unfrozen stew. He was a man of numbers and regulations, and his conversion gave the story an unimpeachable credibility. That March, the Croatian Fraternal Union Lodge 122 in Ely dedicated half of its monthly bulletin to the Marković house. Ivan, a man of few words, drew a simple, clean floor plan and a cross-section of the Quonset in the Crevice. He added notes in Croatian, with dimensions and a list of materials. He didn't write about physics. He wrote about what he had done step by step. The bulletin found its way across the Iron Range. For the other Croatian-American veterans, many of them also struggling in substandard housing, the idea was a revelation. It used cheap, surplus materials, leveraged their historic familiarity with stone, and solved the single greatest problem of their lives. By the autumn of 1950, 4 other families across the range had built their own crevice Quonsets, adapting Ivan's design to the unique geology of their own small plots of land. The idea was spreading, a quiet revolution of common sense. Ivan Marković's innovation was an echo of an ancient past and a preview of a distant future. His work anticipated the principles of modern earth-sheltered construction and passive geothermal design by nearly half a century. He had created a high-mass, super-insulated structure with minimal thermal bridging and near-total protection from wind-driven heat loss. He did it without advanced degrees, without modern materials, and without a word of scientific jargon. He did it by listening to the materials he knew best. In the end, the story of the Crevice Quonset is about a profound shift in perspective. The frontier mindset often viewed nature as an adversary, a force to be conquered, walled out, and subdued. The wind must be blocked, the cold must be fought, the rock must be blasted. Ivan Marković arrived with an older, quieter wisdom. He saw the granite ridge not as an obstacle, but as an ally of immense power. He understood that you could not defeat a Minnesota winter through brute force. You could only survive it through intelligent partnership. He didn't build a wall against the winter. He asked a mountain to be his second wall, and he took the offer. And in that simple, humble request lay the warmth that kept his family safe. This channel presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and engineering. If you are considering any construction project, modern or historical, always follow current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the practical wisdom of the past. If you found this story valuable, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates the power of a good idea.